Hey, church family. So good to be with you again on this Wednesday as we're continuing in our study of walking through the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. And we're kind of in the home stretch, if you will, as today we come to Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 7 concerning judging others and condemning others. There was a young boy who was out on the playground during recess, and he was kind of being a bully and picking on the other children on the playground. And one of his favorite ways to pick on the other kids was by taunting the other kids and making ugly faces at them. And one of the teachers who was out there, kind of supervising and watching all of this, she walked over to him and she said, when I was a little girl, I was told that if I made ugly faces like what you're making, that my face would freeze and it would always stay like that. The little boy looked up at her and he replied, "Well, you can't say you weren't warned." In all seriousness, though, the reality of Jesus' words, or the reality is that Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 7 concerning judging others and condemning others is really no laughing matter at all. So let's look at what he has to say, and then we'll dig in to what he's saying. Matthew chapter 7, starting in verse 1. Here's what he says. "Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Do not give dogs what is sacred, and do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet, and then turn and tear you to pieces." It's quite possible that the most often quoted, and coincidentally most often misquoted words of Jesus in American culture today are these words here in Matthew chapter 7. And most probably know the words as I do from the King James Version, which says, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." The issue, though, is that when most people quote these words in our culture today, they have no idea where they're found. And that can be problematic because knowing where they're found has everything to do with reading it in its proper context. And reading it in its proper context has everything to do with understanding what Jesus is really saying here. Otherwise, it's really easy to jump to all kinds of wrong conclusions and false conclusions about what exactly he is trying to tell us. And it's ironic that of all the things that we make a judgment about too quickly when it comes to what Jesus is saying, it may be these words that he says here in Matthew chapter 7 about not judging. Today in our culture, judging others has come to have such a broad, sweeping definition that now includes virtually any attempt to address someone else's choices or behavior or even someone else's beliefs. But if we walk by our culture's sweeping definition of what it means to judge or to not judge, I think it can actually do more harm than good. Because at the heart of judgment in our culture, there is really an incredible assumption at work. And it's basically this, that truth and morality are all relative anyway. There's nothing universally true or right. And so I get to decide what's true and what's right by what really I want it to be. And so I can do what I want to do. This is what works for me, and you've got no business judging me regarding what I do. But just think about us truly holding to that assumption. I mean, can you imagine an engineer saying that his calculations don't really matter as long as they work for him? You probably wouldn't want to work in any building he's constructing or drive across any bridge that he's building. Or imagine your doctor just giving you a number of prescriptions and telling you just take whatever feels right whenever you feel like taking it. Can you imagine parenting our children under the assumption that it's inappropriate to address or to challenge their behaviors or their beliefs about what is right and what is wrong, what is real and what is not? I mean, in certain cases, it could even mean the difference between life and death for our children. In pretty much every area of life where we can evaluate outcomes, we know that some things work and some things don't. Some answers are right, some answers are wrong. Some things are real and some things are not. And so, getting at what Jesus is really saying here about judgment, I think requires a closer look than just the surface level interpretation that so often many people want to jump to, because it's not what so many people and even so many believers have made it out to be. And so if we're really going to start, or really going to consider what it is that Jesus is saying here, I think it's best to start by considering the meaning of that word judge that Jesus uses here. That word judge is the Greek word krino, and it means a number of different things, but basically it means to separate, to make a distinction between, to exercise judgment upon, to come to a decision, to estimate, to appraise. To judge is not in and of itself a bad thing. In fact, in many ways, it's a good thing, even a needed thing. You and I make judgments and decisions on a daily basis. In fact, if we didn't, there'd probably be quite a few repercussions that we'd have to face. And so again, to judge is not in and of itself a bad thing. In fact, that word is used by Jesus several times in the Gospels, and the context in which he uses it has a lot to do with how we interpret it. And when he says for us not to judge in Matthew chapter 7, it's important to remember that he's addressing people that he refers to as hypocrites, which are mainly the religious leaders of his day. And remember the definition of hypocrite that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, that hypocrisy isn't just someone who doesn't practice what they preach. Someone who says something and then does another, which is the way it's often used in our culture today. But according to Jesus, a hypocrite is also someone who doesn't, who does something, but they do it for the wrong reasons. They may even be doing something right, but they do it for the wrong reasons. And in many cases, the religious leaders that Jesus is talking about here in the Sermon on the Mount, that he addresses so often in the Sermon on the Mount, they're judging others and the actions of others, but they're doing it for the wrong reasons. They're doing it for the sole purpose of condemning them. And Jesus has absolutely no patience for the judgment of others or their actions simply for the purpose of identifying someone as a wrongdoer, labeling them, and then condemning them with no heart toward restoring them. But at the same time, it's important to note that Jesus isn't just putting up some unilateral ban against exercising judgment of any kind in our lives, specifically in regard to other people or the things that they do. But when it comes to exercising judgment in our lives in regards to those things, there is a right way and there is a wrong way. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow. But for now, just consider this. Jesus himself exercise judgment in regard to people and the things that they do. In fact, by my count, over 35 times in the gospel, Jesus confronts the religious leaders and he judges them for their judgmental and unjust ways of living and operating and how they were treating other people. And even in this passage in Matthew chapter 7, Jesus' words just a little further down shed light on the fact that he isn't calling us to abandon judgment altogether. In verse 5, he says, "You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will be able to see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." And so, yes, you and I deal, part of the big point here is that you and I deal with the plank in our own eyes, but we do so that we can help our brother or sister deal with the speck in their eye. And by saying that someone has a speck and helping them to remove it, well, we're exercising judgment. We're making a judgment call. In verse 6, he says, "Do not give dogs what is sacred, and do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and then turn and tear you to pieces." There's a judgment involved in understanding and deciding when not to give what is sacred to dogs or to throw our pearls to pigs. Jesus is saying there's a judgment involved in knowing when to simply move on or when to kind of back off when it comes to sharing God's truth in another person's life, because maybe they just don't want to hear it, or maybe they're not ready to hear it. And by the way, our judgment in that area may be the difference in us getting trampled and torn to pieces. Or look down just a few verses later in verse 15. Jesus says, "Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By By their fruit you will recognize them. Again, evaluating and appraising the fruit of someone else's life involves making a judgment call. Or look a little later in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus speaks to a situation requiring the exercising of judgment. Matthew chapter 18, verse 15, he says, "If your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault just between the two of you." Here, Jesus is speaking of a situation that inevitably is going to happen at some course in our lives. People are going to do us wrong. They're going to sin against us, as Jesus says. And the moment we say that someone has done us wrong, we're making a judgment call. Let me give you a couple more examples of this in the New Testament. In Galatians chapter 6, verse 1, Paul says, "Brothers, if someone is caught in a sin, you who are spiritual should restore that person gently, but watch yourself, or you may also be tempted." In order for us to determine if someone is caught in a sin, it requires us to make a judgment on whether or not that something is a sin and to call it such. Or how about this in James chapter 5, verse 19? James says, "My brothers, if one of you should wander from the truth and someone should bring him back, remember this: whoever turns a sinner from the error of his way will save him from death and cover over a multitude of sins." Again, helping someone come back to the truth involves the exercising of judgment that they are away from the truth in regard to their actions or their mindset. And so in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus speaks to not judging people, we mustn't take it as some unilateral ban on exercising all forms of judgment when it comes to people and the things that they do. What we need to understand is that Jesus is addressing the spirit behind the judgment rather than simply the exercising of it. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit more tomorrow. And so as for today, I hope you have a blessed day, and I hope to see you again tomorrow. God bless.